The thermometer outside Heinrich Vogel's shelter read 43 degrees below zero, but inside his earth-backed den, he sat in shirt-sleeves, watching frost creep across the fur hides that covered his entrance. 50 miles away, trappers in traditional log cabins were burning their furniture to stay alive, unaware that the secret to surviving the worst blizzard in frontier history was building walls that breathed with the earth and sealing your door with layers of dead animals. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten survival wisdom speak to you. Hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you think about shelter forever. The cold came fast on the night of December 9, 1871. Heinrich Vogel woke to the sound of wind hammering against the log walls of the cabin he shared with Lars Anderson in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory. The fire in their stone hearth had burned down to coals. Heinrich could see his breath in the darkness. He rolled from his sleeping platform and fed split pine into the embers, coaxing flame back to life. The temperature inside the cabin felt like it was dropping by the minute. Lars didn't stir. That wasn't unusual. The big Swede slept like a felled tree most nights, exhausted from running trap lines through deep snow. Heinrich added more wood to the fire until flames climbed the chimney and heat began radiating into the small space. He checked the door. Snow had drifted against it during the night, but the gap at the bottom still let in a steady stream of cold air. He stuffed a spare shirt into the opening and returned to his bunk. By morning, the fire had consumed most of their indoor wood supply. Heinrich had fed it constantly through the night, waking every hour to add fuel. Despite his efforts, frost coated the interior walls. The water bucket near the hearth had a skin of ice on top. He climbed down from his platform and walked to Lars's bunk on the opposite wall. Lars Anderson was frozen solid. His face was pale blue. His eyes were open. Heinrich touched his partner's shoulder and felt flesh as hard as the logs around them. Lars had been dead for hours, probably since sometime before midnight. He had frozen to death less than 12 feet from an active fire in a cabin they had built with their own hands just 8 months earlier. Heinrich stood there for a long time, looking at his friend's body. They had trapped together for 3 seasons. Lars was 42 years old, strong as an ox, and smarter about wilderness survival than most men Heinrich had known. And he had frozen to death in his sleep in a cabin that was supposed to keep them safe. The thermometer outside read 18 degrees below zero, cold but not extraordinary for a Wyoming winter. Men survived far worse temperatures regularly. But Lars hadn't survived, and Heinrich understood why with horrible clarity. The cabin was bleeding heat, faster than they could produce it. The logs were chinked with moss and mud, but gaps remained. The door fit poorly. The window was covered with oiled paper that flapped in the wind. Every surface radiated cold inward. The fire fought a losing battle against the laws of physics. Heinrich buried Lars 3 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had set their best trap line. Spring came late to the Wind River Range in 1872. Heinrich spent the winter alone in the cabin that had killed Lars, feeding the fire obsessively, burning through wood at a rate that would have bankrupted 2 men, let alone 1. He survived, but the experience changed him. Every log he split, every armload he carried inside, every hour he spent feeding flames felt like proof of failure. The cabin demanded constant attention just to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. It was a prison that required fuel. When the snow finally melted in late April, Heinrich began wandering. He told himself he was scouting new trap lines, but that wasn't true. He was studying shelters. He watched how animals emerged from winter dens. He found a bear's hibernation cave dug into a south-facing hillside and crawled inside. The interior was noticeably warmer than the outside air, despite having no fire, no insulation, nothing but earth, and the residual heat from the bear's body over months of occupation. He discovered a badger's den complex and marveled at its design. Multiple entrances, chambers at different depths, tunnels that seemed to follow some logic he didn't understand but recognized as intentional. He placed his hand against the dirt walls. They were cool, but not cold. The temperature felt constant, stable, disconnected from the freezing nights and warm days of early spring. Heinrich visited a Shoshone camp in May and spent 3 days observing their structures. Some families used traditional tippas, but others had built more permanent earth lodges for winter use. These weren't crude dugouts. They were sophisticated dwellings partially excavated into the ground, with log frames and thick layers of earth piled over the top. He was invited inside one and immediately felt the difference. The interior was dim and cool despite the warm spring day outside. An old woman explained through gestures and broken English that in winter the lodge stayed warm with a small fire. In summer it stayed cool when the air outside was hot. The principle became obvious through observation. Earth was stable, air was chaos. A log cabin was essentially a wooden box sitting in the air, subject to every temperature swing, every wind gust, every atmospheric change. An earth-sheltered dwelling was embedded in mass that changed temperature slowly, reluctantly, absorbing heat and cold over weeks rather than hours. Heinrich returned to his cabin in June and began sketching plans. He had no formal education in engineering or architecture. His father had been a stonemason in Bavaria, and Heinrich had learned basic construction principles as a boy, but nothing had prepared him for designing a semi-subterranean dwelling. He worked from observation and intuition. Animals went into the earth to escape temperature extremes. Indigenous people used earth as insulation. The logic was simple, even if the execution would be difficult. Other trappers passing through thought he was touched by grief. Heinrich didn't argue with them. He just kept drawing plans and taking measurements and thinking about the thickness of clay and the pitch of roofs and how deep a man needed to dig to find stable temperature. Heinrich selected his site in early July of 1872. The location was a half-mile from his old cabin on a hillside that faced south and received maximum sun exposure during winter months. The slope was gentle enough to dig into, but steep enough to provide natural drainage. He spent 2 days testing the soil with an iron rod, pushing it deep to check composition, and depth to bedrock. At 3 feet down, the rod still moved through earth. At 4 feet, it hit resistance but not solid rock. The soil was clay-rich, dense, and slightly damp even in summer. Perfect. He began excavating on July 8th. The work was brutal. Heinrich started by outlining the dimensions with stakes and twine. 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hillside, 4 feet of vertical excavation from the entrance. He used a pickaxe to break the compacted earth, a shovel to remove it, and an iron prying bar to lever out rocks too large to dig around. The clay soil was both blessing and curse. It held its shape well, meaning the walls didn't collapse as he dug, but it also clung to his tools and required constant effort to break apart. By the end of the first week, he had excavated roughly 2 feet into the hillside. His hands were covered in blisters that broke and reformed daily. His back ached from the repetitive motion of swinging the pick, bending to shovel, standing to throw dirt onto the growing pile outside the excavation. He worked from dawn until his body gave out each day, usually around mid-afternoon when the heat became oppressive and his muscles simply refused to continue. Other trappers occasionally passed by and watched him work. A French-Canadian named Baptiste Moreau stopped for 2 days and asked questions. Heinrich barely answered. What was he building? A shelter. Why was he digging instead of cutting logs? Because earth doesn't burn and doesn't rot. Baptiste shook his head and called it the strangest thing he had seen in 20 years of mountain living. He offered to help. Heinrich declined. This was something he needed to do alone, a penance for Lars, a solution to a problem only he seemed to understand. By late July, the excavation was complete. Heinrich stood inside a rectangular pit 4 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 12 feet long, cut into the hillside. The walls were rough but stable. The floor was slightly below level, sloping toward the entrance for water drainage. The back wall was solid earth. The ceiling was open sky. He had removed approximately 300 cubic feet of soil and rock, all of it piled in a massive mound near the entrance that he would later use for the roof. Heinrich ran his hand along the clay walls and felt their coolness even in the heat of summer. This would work. It had to work. Winter was only 4 months away. Heinrich began wall construction in early August. The excavated pit provided the basic structure, but the walls needed refinement and reinforcement to function as true thermal mass. He started by smoothing the interior surfaces with a flat wooden paddle, compacting the clay and removing loose material. The goal was walls that were dense, uniform, and thick enough to store and release heat slowly over days rather than hours. This was the foundation of everything. Without proper thermal mass, the den would be nothing more than a hole in the ground. He mixed clay-rich soil from his excavation pile with sand he hauled from a nearby creek bed. The ratio was roughly 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. The sand prevented the clay from cracking as it dried and added structural integrity. He added water until the mixture achieved a thick, moldable consistency, then packed it against the existing walls in layers 6 inches thick. He worked one section at a time, applying the mixture with his hands and tamping it firm with a wooden block. The process was methodical and slow. Each layer needed to dry partially before he added the next. Otherwise, the weight caused slumping and separation. In the August heat, layers dried enough to support additional material in about 2 days. Heinrich worked in rotations, packing one wall section, moving to another while the first dried, returning to add another layer. Over 3 weeks, he built the walls from their original rough excavation to finished surfaces, 18 inches thick. The thickness was everything. Thermal mass required volume. Thin walls responded quickly to temperature changes, cooling rapidly when outside air dropped and warming quickly when sun hit them. 18-inch thick earth walls would take days to fully cool, even in sub-zero temperatures. During that cooling process, they would radiate stored warmth into the interior space. The physics were simple. Dense material held temperature. The denser and thicker the material, the longer it held. An 18-inch earth wall contained exponentially more thermal capacity than a 12-inch log wall, and the earth would never rot, crack, or burn. Heinrich also packed earth against the exterior sides of the excavation, building berms that sloped away from the structure. This served 2 purposes. First, it directed water runoff away from the dwelling, preventing moisture from seeping through the walls. Second, it added additional thermal mass around the sides, creating an envelope of stable temperature earth surrounding the living space on 3 sides. Only the entrance face would be exposed to air. While the walls dried, he prepared structural elements for the roof. He cut and hauled 6 pine logs, each roughly 8 inches in diameter and 10 feet long. These would serve as the primary roof beams spanning from the front header to the back wall. He also split planks from straight-grained pine, creating rough boards 8 inches wide and 6 feet long. The planks would lay perpendicular across the beams, forming the roof deck. The log header beam was critical. It had to support the weight of the roof beams, the planks, the earth covering, and eventually the snow that would accumulate. Heinrich raised the header beam on September 2nd with a system of levers and wooden props. The beam weighed close to 200 pounds, far too heavy to lift alone. He positioned one end on the left wall, then used a stout branch as a lever to raise the opposite end inch by inch, wedging blocks underneath as he gained height. It took most of a day, but by evening the header sat firmly in its notches, level and secure, ready to bear the weight of everything above. The 6 roof beams went up over the next 3 days. Each beam rested on the header at the front and was notched into the back wall of the excavation. Heinrich spaced them 18 inches apart, close enough that the planks spanning between them would have minimal flex. He secured each beam with wooden pegs driven through angled holes, locking them to the header and preventing lateral movement. The frame was solid, capable of supporting hundreds of pounds. The plank deck came next. Heinrich laid split boards perpendicular to the beams, fitting them tightly edge to edge. The planks weren't perfect. Gaps of 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch existed between some boards. That was acceptable. The planks weren't meant to be waterproof by themselves. They were structural support for the layers above. He pegged each plank to the beams underneath, creating a solid platform that barely flexed when he walked across it. Over the planks, he laid birch bark. He had harvested the bark in late spring when it peeled easily from trees, then stored it flat under weights to prevent curling. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and rot-resistant. He overlapped the sheets like shingles, starting at the bottom edge and working upward so water would shed downward without penetrating gaps. The bark layer added waterproofing and a smooth surface for the earth that would go on top. The earth layer was 12 inches of the same clay-sand mixture he had used for the walls. Heinrich hauled it up in buckets and spread it evenly across the birch bark, packing it firm as he went. 12 inches was deliberate. Thinner and the earth wouldn't provide adequate insulation or thermal mass. Thicker and the weight might exceed what his beams could support. He sloped the earth gently from back to front, creating drainage that would direct water away from the entrance. While the earth layer was still damp, Heinrich transplanted moss to the roof edges and the transition points where earth met exposed wood. He had scouted patches of thick, healthy moss growing along a creek bank a quarter-mile away. The moss grew in dense mats, several inches thick, vibrant green even in late summer. He cut sections roughly 1 foot square, keeping the root systems intact, and carried them to his structure. He pressed the moss firmly into the damp soil at the roof perimeter and along the upper edges of the side walls where the earth covering ended. The moss established quickly at these transition points. Within 2 weeks, the separate pieces had merged into continuous strips of living insulation. The root systems penetrated the earth beneath, anchoring the moss and drawing moisture. The dense growth sealed gaps where air might otherwise penetrate, providing additional insulation exactly where the structure needed it most. The entrance was the vulnerability Heinrich obsessed over through late September. Every principle of his design focused on retaining heat, but any conventional door would compromise everything. Doors leaked air around their edges. Hinges created gaps. Every time a door opened, warm interior air rushed out and cold exterior air flooded in. The earth walls could store heat perfectly, but if that heat escaped through the entrance faster than the walls released it, the entire system failed. Heinrich needed a solution that sealed the opening without rigid barriers that had to swing wide. He built the entrance in 2 parts. The outer section was a narrow tunnel 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 3 feet high, framed with logs and packed with earth on the sides and top. The tunnel extended from the front of the structure outward, creating a transitional space between interior and exterior. The small dimensions were intentional. A low, narrow opening limited how much air could exchange during entry or exit. At the inner end of the tunnel, Heinrich installed a wooden door for security. The door was thick planks fitted tightly together and hung on iron hinges he had purchased in South Pass City the previous year. It opened inward and could be barred from inside with a heavy wooden beam. This door would remain closed most of the winter. It was backup, a seal against intruders or animals, not the primary thermal barrier. The primary barrier was fur. Heinrich had collected hides throughout the previous winter and spring. He had elk hides, buffalo hides, 2 bear hides, and several deer skins. He selected the thickest, most supple hides and cut them into rectangular sections approximately 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. Each hide was larger than the entrance opening, ensuring complete coverage with overlap. He mounted the hides at the outer end of the entrance tunnel using a wooden rod suspended across the opening. The hides hung vertically, overlapping like curtains, creating multiple independent layers. He started with the heaviest hide, a buffalo skin nearly half an inch thick with dense winter fur, as the outermost layer. Behind it he hung an elk hide with coarse hair that trapped air effectively. Behind that, a bear hide with thick underfur. Finally, closest to the interior, another elk hide. 4 layers total, each one hanging independently, each one capable of swinging aside when pushed but falling back into place immediately from its own weight. The system worked like an airlock. To enter the den, Heinrich pushed through the first hide, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, finally reaching the inner wooden door. Each hide he passed through fell back into position behind him, preventing direct air exchange between interior and exterior. Cold air that entered with him was trapped in the spaces between hides and never reached the inner living space. The fur itself provided insulation, and the dead air pockets between layers added resistance to heat transfer. Heinrich completed the interior work through October. The space was small, only 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a ceiling height of 6 feet at the entrance tapering to 5 feet at the back where the roof met the rear wall. Every element had to serve multiple purposes. Storage, sleeping, cooking, and heating all needed to function in less than 100 square feet of floor space. He built a sleeping platform along the left wall, raised 2 feet off the earth floor. The platform was simple construction, split planks laid across log supports and pegged in place. The elevation served 2 purposes. First, it kept him off the cold ground where dense air settled. Second, it created storage space underneath for supplies that needed to stay dry. He stuffed the space beneath the platform with his spare furs, extra clothing, and tools. The fire pit was the most critical element. Heinrich built it in the center of the floor, offset slightly toward the entrance. He dug down 8 inches and lined the pit with flat stones he had gathered from the creek. The stones would absorb heat and radiate it long after the fire died down, adding to the thermal mass effect of the walls. The pit was small, only 2 feet across, because the den didn't need a large fire. The earth walls retained heat so effectively that a modest fire would maintain comfortable temperatures. For ventilation, he created a simple chimney using a hollowed log 8 inches in diameter. He had burned out the center over the course of several days, creating a tube that extended from above the fire pit through the roof. He lined the interior with clay to protect the wood from burning and sealed the roof penetration with additional clay mixed with sand. The chimney drew adequately, pulling smoke up and out without creating excessive draft that would waste heat. Heinrich moved into the den on October 23rd. That night, the temperature outside dropped to 28 degrees. He built a small fire, using perhaps 1/10 the wood he would have burned in his old cabin. By midnight, with the fire reduced to coals, the interior temperature held steady at 55 degrees. He lay on his platform under a single blanket, comfortable, listening to wind outside that he could barely feel inside. Over the next 3 weeks, he refined small details. He built a shelf along the right wall for food supplies. He created a simple table that folded down from the wall when needed. He hung his rifles and traps from wooden pegs driven into the earth walls, which held them securely. He positioned his water bucket near the fire pit where it would never freeze. The first serious cold arrived in mid-November. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees below zero. Heinrich burned a fire for 3 hours in the evening, then let it die completely. By morning, the interior temperature was 48 degrees. He had slept through the night, without adding wood, without waking cold, without the constant anxiety that had defined winter in his old cabin. January of 1872 brought weather that old-timers would talk about for the rest of their lives. The first week passed normally, cold but manageable, with temperatures ranging from 10 above to 15 below zero. Heinrich ran his trap lines, checked his supplies, and maintained his den with minimal effort. He burned perhaps 3 small armloads of wood per day, far less than he had ever used in a traditional cabin. The earth walls released their stored heat gradually, keeping the interior comfortable with fires that would have been worthless in an above-ground structure. On January 9th, the sky changed. Heavy gray clouds rolled in from the northwest, low and dense, carrying the particular quality of light that promised serious snow. The temperature began dropping steadily. By evening, it was 20 below. By midnight, it was 30 below. Heinrich woke once during the night to add wood to his fire, more from habit than need. The den remained warm, the thick walls barely noticing the temperature change outside. The snow started before dawn on January 10th. Not the light, dry powder common to Wyoming winters, but heavy, wet flakes that fell steadily and accumulated fast. By mid-morning, 6 inches covered the ground. By afternoon, a foot. Heinrich went outside once to check his surroundings and immediately retreated. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally, creating drifts that were already waist-deep in places. He pushed back through his fur curtains and sealed himself inside. The storm continued without pause. January 10th became January 11th. The snow kept falling, the wind kept blowing. Drifts piled against the hillside where Heinrich's den was located, burying the entrance tunnel under 4 feet of snow, then 5, then 6. The weight pressed down on his roof, compacting the earth layer, adding insulation. Inside, Heinrich was barely aware of what was happening above him. The den remained dim, quiet, and warm. He maintained a small fire during the day, letting it die at night. He ate from his stored supplies. He mended equipment by firelight. He slept long hours, conserving energy, trusting his structure to protect him. The fury happening outside was irrelevant. The earth surrounding him on 3 sides maintained its stable temperature. The snow piling on top added an insulating blanket that made the den even more efficient. The fur curtains at the entrance prevented any air exchange with the chaos beyond. On January 13th, the temperature outside dropped to 43 degrees below zero. It was the coldest temperature ever recorded in that region up to that point. Men 50 miles away were making desperate decisions about what to burn to stay alive. Heinrich sat in his den in shirt sleeves, eating dried elk meat and thinking about where he would set his traps when the storm finally passed. The fire in his pit was barely larger than what a man might use to cook a meal. It was enough. The storm lasted 9 days. Snow fell continuously through January 18th. When it finally stopped, the landscape had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Drifts reached 12 feet in sheltered areas. The Wind River Valley was buried under an average of 7 feet of snow. The few trails that had existed were gone, erased by wind and accumulation. The temperature remained brutally cold, never rising above zero even at midday. Heinrich emerged from his den on January 19th. He had to dig through 5 feet of compacted snow that had buried his entrance tunnel. The work took 2 hours, tunneling upward through layers that had compressed into something approaching ice. When he finally broke through to the surface, the world was silent and white and empty. He stood on top of the drift that covered his den and looked around. If he hadn't known exactly where he was, he would never have guessed a dwelling existed beneath his feet. He spent that day checking the area. His old cabin, the one where Lars had died, was still standing, but the door had blown open and snow had filled the interior. His current woodpile was buried but retrievable. His trap lines were completely obscured and would remain useless until a significant thaw. But he was alive, healthy, and had burned perhaps 1/4 of his winter wood supply. The den had functioned exactly as he had hoped. Over the next week, as the cold persisted but no new snow fell, Heinrich began encountering evidence of what the storm had done to others. He found William Carver's cabin 4 miles east on January 22nd. The door was frozen shut. Heinrich forced it open and found Carver's body inside, frozen in a sitting position near a cold fireplace. The cabin's interior showed the story clearly. Carver had burned his table, then his chairs, then his sleeping platform, trying to generate enough heat to survive. It hadn't been enough. The cabin had bled warmth, faster than burning furniture could replace it. On January 25th, Heinrich reached the Morrison brothers' camp 7 miles north. Both men were alive but in poor condition. They had survived by sheltering together in one cabin and burning everything that would combust, including half their food supplies stored in wooden crates and part of their roof structure. They had suffered frostbite on their fingers and feet. Their faces showed the exhaustion of 9 days spent in constant crisis, feeding fires that could never get ahead of the cold draining through log walls. When the Morrison brothers saw Heinrich, healthy and calm, they asked how he had survived. He told them about the den. They didn't believe him at first. A hole in the ground couldn't be warmer than a proper cabin. Heinrich invited them to see for themselves. 3 days later, when they were strong enough to travel, they made the journey. They stood inside Heinrich's den and felt the stable temperature maintained by earth walls and understood that everything they knew about frontier shelter was wrong. Word of Heinrich's survival spread through the scattered trapping community during the winter of 1872 and into the spring thaw. Men who had barely survived the blizzard, who had burned half their possessions to stay alive, who had lost partners or suffered frostbite, began asking questions. How thick were the walls? How did he seal the entrance? What about moisture? Could it work in different soil types? Heinrich answered every question with the patience of someone who understood he had stumbled onto something important. By the fall of 1872, 3 other trappers had built earth-sheltered dens using variations of Heinrich's design. Baptiste Moreau, the French-Canadian who had watched Heinrich dig and called him crazy, built one on the Sweetwater River. The Morrison brothers collaborated on a larger version that housed them both. A young trapper named Jesse Whitman built one in the Absaroka Range after his first Wyoming winter nearly killed him in a traditional cabin. Each structure incorporated the core principles: earth-backed walls for thermal mass, fur curtains for the entrance, strategic use of living moss at transition points. The technique spread beyond trappers. Homesteaders moving into the territory in the 1870s adopted earth-sheltered construction for winter dwellings. Some built fully subterranean structures. Others created hybrid designs with earth-backed walls and conventional peaked roofs. The United States Army built earth-sheltered storage facilities and quarters at remote outposts where wood was scarce and winters were brutal. The designs varied, but the principle remained constant. Earth provides thermal stability that wood cannot match. Heinrich continued trapping until 1878, then transitioned to guiding and teaching wilderness skills. He married in 1879 a widow named Sarah Kendrick, who had homesteaded alone for 2 years. They built a frame house near South Pass City, but Heinrich maintained his original den and took men there regularly to demonstrate its construction. He never charged for the instruction. He considered the knowledge too important to commodify. The den itself remained functional for decades. Heinrich used it occasionally when guiding parties into remote areas. Other trappers and travelers used it as shelter when passing through the region. The earth walls, built with such care in the summer of 1872, showed no signs of deterioration. The moss on the roof edges continued growing, providing insulation to a structure that had outlasted most of the log cabins built during the same era. Heinrich Vogel died in 1906 at the age of 68. By then, earth-sheltered construction had become common enough in frontier regions that most people didn't know its origins. The phrase, "warm as a Vogel den," persisted in Wyoming and Montana into the early 20th century, a compliment for any well-built shelter. Heinrich's original structure remained standing and usable until at least 1920, documented in a surveyor's report as an example of frontier ingenuity. The impossible had become practical.